Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thanks for coming back. If you were enjoying the Seerah, I apologize for the break, but I hope you had a good break. If you've been forced to come here because of your parents or your significant other, you're welcome. You've got a break, but now you're back, so we'll start, and inshallah you'll find this beneficial. Where we left off is where we saw the death of the Prophet ﷺ's mother. The Prophet ﷺ's birth, we covered that, and how he went under the guardianship of Abdul Muttalib and later Abu Talib. So this is where we stopped, if you remember. And now we're going to go from there onwards. It will get a lot more interesting now because we are now covering the actual life of the Prophet. You will, inshallah, will be able to bring out his character, his personality, his appearance, and how he managed certain situations in life, inshallah. But before we do that, we will start with the quiz. So, the website, I'm sorry, again, we're having technical difficulties. I don't have the PowerPoint to, is it clear with the mic or not clear? I mean, the mask? Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties. We can't seem to connect it to the TV, but we'll make do. So, the website link, so if you've got your phones out, if you've got your laptops from home, it is www.kahoot.it. So that's www.kahoot.it. And if you're waiting for the pin, it is 771072. 771072. So I'll give you the website again, www.kahoot.it. And the pin is 771072. So we've got 5 people joining in. Yes, you can remain anonymous if you don't want your scores coming up, but if you're remaining anonymous, please have the same anonymous nickname, because like I said before, I try to keep a record of the top 3 people, and at the end of the Seerah, inshallah, I will give a present of a nice Seerah book for whoever comes top or consistently comes top. The pin is 771072. 771072. So the last time, the website is www.kahoot.it, and the pin is 771072. Okay, so we will start. And because we had a bit of a break, I thought it would be fun to have some questions from the previous couple of weeks. So weeks 1, weeks 2. Yes. Isn't it fun? All right, so everyone ready? Are we good to go? If you're joining again, it's www.kahoot.it, 771072. Okay. All right, Seerah week 4. The 3 groups of Arabs were the pure Arabs, the Arabized Arabs, and what was the third group? The 3 groups of Arabs were the pure Arabs, Arabized Arabs, and purified Arabs, perished Arabs, diminished Arabs, or the Adnanian Arabs. Which was the third group of Arabs? Remember, you get points for answering fast as well. This was from week 1. The correct answer is the perished Arabs. 6 of you got that right. Adib, you're on top. Next question. The tribe to first rule over Mecca is the Khuzah, the Quraysh, the Jurhum, or Hajar. Which tribe ruled over Mecca? Which tribe was the first to rule over Mecca, rather? Which tribe was the first to rule over Mecca? The Khuzah, the Quraysh, the Jurhum, the Hajar. The correct answer is the Jurhum. Most of you got the Quraysh. No, the Quraysh was the third tribe to rule. It was the Jurhum, and then the Khuzah, and then the Quraysh came. Nabi's on top. Good job. Third question. Which of these was not one of the Arab kingdoms in the region? Which was not? The Himyarite kingdom, the Al-Ahmad kingdom, the Ghassanid kingdom, or the Abyssinian kingdom? Which was not one of the three Arab kingdoms? The Himyarite, the Al-Ahmad, the Ghassanid, or Abyssinian? The correct answer was the Abyssinian. The Abyssinian was an Ethiopian or East African empire. They were not a kingdom, and they weren't Arab. Oh, Nabi, you're on fire. Fourth question. Shaiba had a dream which told him how to find the well of Zamzam. True or false? Shaiba had a dream which told him how to find the well of Zamzam. True or false? The answer is true. Oh, that was close. 7-6. If you're wondering why, Shaiba was the name of Abdul Muttalib. Abdul Muttalib had the dream. Shaiba's nickname was Abdul Muttalib. Fifth question. Abdul Muttalib promised he would sacrifice his youngest son if he had how many sons? 5 sons, 10 sons, 12 sons, or 15 sons? Abdul Muttalib made a vow that if he had how many sons, that he would sacrifice the youngest one? 5, 10, 12, or 15? The answer is 10. Yes, most of you got it right, 10. Muki, you have a streak of 4 correct answers in a row, so good job. Qusay had Abdul Manaf. Abdul Manaf had question mark, Abdul Muttalib, and then question mark had Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So who were the 2 question marks? This is a bit tricky one. Was it Hashim and Shaiba? Was it Hashim and Abdullah? Was it Shaiba and Abdullah? And was it Hashim and Abu Talib? In the order. So who was Abdul Manaf's son? And who was Abdul Muttalib's son? The answer is Hashim and Abdullah. Prophet Muhammad was born in which year? Prophet Muhammad was born in which year? 570 AD, 575 AD, 470 AD, 740 AD. Which year was the Prophet born? 570, 575, 470, or 740? The answer is 570 AD. Good, a lot of you guys got that right. Abraha was the governor of where? Of Yemen, of Persia, of Abyssinia, or of the Ghassanid kingdom? Abraha was the governor of either Yemen, Persia, Abyssinia, or the Ghassanid kingdom. He was the governor of Yemen. He was from the Abyssinian kingdom. He was from the Abyssinian kingdom, but he was governing on behalf of the Abyssinian kingdom, the region of Yemen. Which of these was not a sign that occurred at the birth of the Prophet ﷺ? The Zoroastrian fire which burned for thousands of years went out, a sacred lake dried up, a comet was seen in the sky, Amina had a dream. Which was not a sign? The Zoroastrian fire went out, the sacred lake dried up, a comet was seen in the sky, or Amina had a dream. A comet was seen in the sky was not. The Zoroastrian fire, which was burning for 1,000 years, did go out. So a lot of you said that it didn't, but it did. The Bedouin couple that fostered the Prophet ﷺ was called Hamza and Halima. True or false? The couple that fostered the Prophet ﷺ was called Hamza and Halima. True or false? Hamza and Halima. Oof. So everyone said it was true. It was false. It was Halima, but it was Harith and Halima, not Hamza. Harith and Halima. Not one of you guys got that right. Oh dear. It was a trick. It was tricky. I'll give you that. What scary event happened to the Prophet while with Halima and Harith? This is an easy one. What scary event happened to the Prophet while with Halima and Harith? The Prophet fell ill. The Prophet got injured. The Prophet's chest was opened and cleaned. The Prophet received the mark of prophethood on his back. Which scary event happened to the Prophet ﷺ while he was with Halima and Harith? So he was fairly young at this stage, very young actually, in his first four years. The Prophet's chest was opened and cleaned. That's correct. Last question. Who was the only person with the Prophet when his mother Amina passed away? Who was the only person with the Prophet ﷺ when his mother Amina passed away? Abu Talib, Fatima, Abdul Muttalib, Baraka. Abu Talib, Fatima, Abdul Muttalib, Baraka. Who was the only person with the Prophet? It was Baraka. And we'll touch on Baraka later. So let's see, who wins? At number 3 is Nazia. At number 2 is Canberra, whoever that is. And at number 1, it is Nabi. Good job. So let me take a quick photo of that. All right, so let's start for this week. I again apologize for not having the slides. It is a shame because we had some good slides this week, but I'll try to work and talk you through it. So like I said, where we left off was with the death of the Prophet ﷺ's mother, and he's now under the guardianship of Abu Talib. Abdul Muttalib looked after him, he passed away, and it's now with Abu Talib. Now, when Abdul Muttalib passed away, Abdul Muttalib was the head of the Quraysh. He was one of the elders, the chieftains. But when he passed away, he didn't leave much for his children. He wasn't very wealthy. Some of his children were wealthy. Abu Lahab was very wealthy because he had his own prospering business. But he couldn't leave a lot of wealth. This meant that Abu Talib did not have much wealth. He was quite poor. Even though he was very well respected, he was quite poor. So Abu Talib, as you know, was the one now who was looking after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and we're talking about the Prophet's age being around 12 years of age. To help Abu Talib, everyone in the household had to start working to make sure that there was food on the table. So at the age of 12, the Prophet ﷺ joins a trading caravan that's going to Syria, and he joins it with Abu Talib. On the way to Syria, there is a little town just outside of Damascus called Bostra. Now, you know, if you know the story, you know where we're going with this. The Syrian region at this time was part of the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantines were Coptic Christians. And as they were nearing Damascus, in Bostra, there was a monk by the name of, anyone? The name of? Anyone know the name of the monk? No. Bahira. This monk was a hermit. He was living in one of the caves overlooking the trading route. And he had actually established himself there because in his research and his studies of the scriptures, he knew that possibly the Prophet was coming on this route or in this direction. So he established himself there and he was overlooking the trading route. And one day as he was looking over, he sees a caravan coming from the south. So Syria is on the north and the caravan's coming from the south. And he sees something very, very interesting. There is a cloud that's floating over the caravan. So where the caravan goes, the cloud follows. And it's providing shade. So there's all these other caravans, there's no shade at all, but on this particular caravan, there is shade. And as he keeps looking, this caravan comes to rest under a particular tree. Now, I wish I had the slides because I have a photo of this tree. This tree, a lot of scholars call it, is called the last living Sahaba. there's a bit of contention into this because, for a Sahaba, you have to be a Muslim. The tree is not necessarily a Muslim, but it's a beautiful title, or it's called the Blessed Tree. Now, there is a documentary, if you're interested, called the Blessed Tree. This tree is in Jordan currently, and you can still see it to this very day. And it's still healthy, it's still alive, and the Prophet ﷺ's caravan, he's 12 years old now, stops underneath this tree. And then Bahira notices something else which is very strange. The branches of the trees starts to bend, and it's almost like it's covering all the people that are under this tree, providing further shade. Now Bahira is too suspicious by now to let this pass, so he sends a message saying, I want to invite everyone in this caravan to have a meal with me. So he sends his message, and Abu Talib and all the people in the caravan, they come to Bahira's residence, and he lays out this feast for him. But he's looking at each of the people that come, and it doesn't make sense. None of them seem to be the type of person he's looking for. So he asks the people there, is everyone here? And they say, yes, everyone's here. Everyone from the caravan's here. And he said, no, tell me the truth. Is everyone here? And they said, well, there's this 12-year-old boy. He's not really a man as such. He's a boy. So we left him underneath the tree to look after the camels. And Bahira says, can you please call him as well? So they go, and this 12-year-old boy is the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ is called, and he comes, and he sits down with all the men. And Bahira immediately notices that there is something special about this boy. So he asks Abu Talib, whose father is this? And Abu Talib says, I am his father, he's my son. And Bahira says, no, whose father is this? And again Abu Talib says, it's my son. And Bahira says, that cannot be. The reason is because the prophecy of the coming prophet was to be an orphan. He cannot have a father. So he asks Abu Talib again. Abu Talib says, well, if you mean the biological father, it was my brother, Abdullah. I'm his uncle, and I have taken guardianship over him. And then Bahira says, can I ask a strange question? Can I have a look at his shoulder? And so Abu Talib thinks it's a bit weird, but tells the Prophet to lower his cloak, and he does, and there is a mark on the Prophet ﷺ's shoulder. Now, I will read from the Shama'il. This is the narrations of the Prophet's description, personality. And there's two that I'll read for you. One is in Muslim and at Tirmidhi, and it's narrated by Jabir ibn Samura. And he says, I saw the seal between the shoulder of Allah's Messenger, ﷺ, and it was a red swelling like the egg of a dove. And then there's another narration that comes from Ali. I love Ali's narrations. If you've ever read Ali's narrations, they're very different to the narrations of other Sahaba. The other Sahaba will give you facts. I saw this, it looked like this, and this is how it sounded, or this is what the Prophet said. Ali's is very, very poetic. Every narration he gives is very poetic and very beautiful. And here's the description. He says, and Ali describes Allah's Messenger, and then he related the tradition in full. He said, between his shoulders was the seal of prophethood, for he is the seal of prophethood. Do you see what I mean about Ali's narrations? He said, between his shoulders is the seal of prophethood, because the Prophet is the seal of prophethood. So, there was this mark, and Bahira sees it, and he knows immediately that this is the Prophet that he has been waiting for so long. So he tells to Abu Talib, and he says, take good care of him, because there will be people who wish to harm him. Abu Talib keeps this in the back of his mind. We're getting to the stage now where the Prophet ﷺ is in his teens now. Okay, so he's entered his teenage years. And the Prophet ﷺ starts to work as does anyone know what he works as in his teenage years? Anyone guess what he was working as in his teenage years? A shepherd. But here's an interesting thing. The Prophet ﷺ says, every prophet that Allah sent was a shepherd of sheep. He doesn't say just shepherd. He says was a shepherd of sheep. Now the scholars say a very interesting thing about this. They say, you can be a shepherd of goats or you can be a shepherd of sheep. If you say shepherd, you can be of either. The reason why the Prophet ﷺ said that every prophet that came before me, every prophet that ever came was a shepherd of sheep, was if you know the personality of sheep and goats, you know the difference. For a goat, you can hurt a goat by screaming at it, yelling at it, throwing stones at it. It will still go where you want it to go. But a sheep is more intelligent. if you harm it, if you hurt it, if you shout at it, it will run away from the herd. So for a sheep, you need to gain its respect. You need to gain its love. And it will follow the person that it loves. And so the scholars say that the reason why Allah deemed it for all the prophets to be prophets of sheep, shepherds of sheep, is to learn, to get them prepared to be, if you will, shepherds of people. To know how to be loving to them and caring, and to set a standard that they will follow out of respect rather than fear. So the Prophet ﷺ in his early teens, he's a shepherd, and he looks after the sheep, and he does that for different wealthy families. And then he also starts to learn military things. He learns to use a sword, he learns to wrestle, he learns to shoot arrows. Interesting thing is that the Prophet ﷺ was very, very good at archery. He was well known from all the young people that he was one of the best in archery. Now, at this time, a war breaks out, and it's called the Sacrilegious War. It's called the Sacrilegious War because during the Quraysh had this thing, or the Arab tribes had this thing, that during certain months you never fight, because they're holy months. This particular war, however, happened during one of these holy months, so therefore it was sacrilegious. The Quraysh weren't directly involved, but they were allied with one of the tribes that were involved, and because of the alliances, all these tribes were now fighting other tribes. And there was a lot of bloodshed. The Prophet ﷺ did not fight, but this was his first experience of war. He did go to the battlefield, and around the age of 15, he went to the battlefield, and his job was to collect the arrows that the other side had shot. So he would collect the arrows and give it to his side. And even then, even at the age of 15, he made a name for himself as being very brave, I assume because he would run out and collect the arrows while the arrows were still flying. Now, at this time, the Quraysh realized something after the war had ended. So many people had died that they started questioning their tribal system. All the neighboring kingdoms, the Ghassanids, the Al-Ahmadids, the Byzantines, the Persians, the Abyssinians, they all had a system of law, of justice, a code, some sort of code. The Quraysh realized us Arabs do not have any code. Our entire system of justice is based on tribal alliances. If my allied tribe was going to war, I would also go to war, regardless of whether that tribe was right or wrong. It was not a matter of right or wrong. It was a matter of alliances. And it was a matter of how strong your tribe was. A strong tribe was always right. A weak tribe was always wrong. And the Arabs started questioning themselves at this time because of the deaths that happened with the Sacrilegious War. Then when the Prophet ﷺ was a bit older, another event happened. Now this event was groundbreaking for the Arab society that was living in Mecca at the time. And I'll tell you why. A Yemen merchant had come to Mecca and he had been swindled. He'd been cheated by a person from the tribe of Saham. From the tribe of Saham. Do you remember I said that at this time there were two parties, two groups that the tribes aligned with? Either the Confederates or the centered ones. You remember that? Bear with me, it's a bit heavy, I know, but there's a reason I'm telling all this. The Sahams was from the group of the Confederates, the alliance, the Confederate alliance. Now this guy had swindled this Yemeni merchant, and the Yemeni merchant went to the Kaaba and started shouting, "O Quraysh, do you have no honor? Do you not feel pity for me? This is obviously an injustice. Will no one help me?" Zubair ibn Abdul Muttalib, that name should give you a clue. Who is he to the Prophet ﷺ? Zubair ibn Abdul Muttalib. His uncle. His uncle, Abu Talib's brother. Abdul Muttalib is the father, Ibn Abdul Muttalib is the uncle. So Prophet ﷺ's uncle hears this and he feels shame. He says, this is not right how we are running our society. And he calls all the tribes, the leaders of all the tribes together, and he says, we need to do something about this. And at this meeting, they decide to create a pact, and the pact was called the Pact of Chivalry, Hilf Al-Fudul. During this, there were two young people, Abu Bakr and the Prophet ﷺ. He was also, Zubair invited his nephew, to this meeting. And this pact, they made an agreement, and they said that no matter what alliances we have, and no matter what relationships we have, if we see that someone is wronged, we will stand on the side of justice and protect the person who is wrong. Now, one thing to note is that out of the 14 tribes, only 5 tribes signed up for it. And none of the Confederate tribes signed up for it. Of the centered tribe, actually, that's wrong. One of the Confederate tribes did, the tribe of Adi. The Adi tribe was the tribe that Abu Bakr belonged to. And Abu Bakr would later be the chief of that tribe. That was the only Confederate tribe. From the centered ones, only 4 of the tribes joined. The wealthy tribes of Banu Makhzum and I've forgotten the other one, 2 of the wealthy tribes did not sign up because they wanted the status quo. They didn't want to rock the boat. But this pact of chivalry actually rocked the boat. This was a groundbreaking thing because it completely destroyed the political system of alliances and said we will stand for justice rather than what our alliances or our relationships are. Now the Prophet ﷺ talks about this later. And he says this, I witnessed a confederacy in the house of Abdullah bin Jadan. It was more appealing to me than herds of cattle. Even now, in the period of Islam, I would respond positively to attending such a meeting if I was invited. This statement has a lot of meaning. The reason is that the Prophet, there's 2 lessons we can take from this. One is, the Prophet is saying that where you find good, it is good. It doesn't matter if it came from a Muslim or not Muslim. It doesn't matter if it's from someone you like or you don't like. What is good is good. And the Prophet is saying, even in Islam, even as a Muslim, I still respect and I still love that event that happened amongst the polytheists. The second thing that the lesson we can have is, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf talks about this, and I'll read from his quote. He says, this is an indication that Muslims should be on the side of truth, even if it is coming from non-Muslims. It teaches that Muslims that we should not be in a Jahali framework. A Muslim must stand up for the truth and not support a fellow Muslim against a Jew or a Christian when it is clearly the case that the Jew or the Christian is oppressed and the Muslim is oppressing. This is a radical change from the psychology of the Arabs, and the Prophet ﷺ is letting us know that Islam is no different. Don't make the Muslims into a tribe where you take the vengeance for your Muslim brother if he is the oppressor against the oppressed. There are some really interesting stories in the Seerah literature about the Prophet ﷺ supporting the non-Muslims against the Muslims. So that's a very important lesson, I think, for us to take. And we know in the Quran where it says, stand up for justice, even if it's against yourself, even if it's against your family. We know the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ where he says that, if you see someone oppressing, stand against him by action. If you can't by action, stand against him by word. If you can't by word, at least by your mind, stand up against that. It is a very important fundamental thing as Muslims that we have to stand in the side of justice when you see it. Now, we're going into the period where the Prophet ﷺ is in his 20s. So we passed his teenage and he's now into his 20s. Around the mid-20s, the Prophet ﷺ starts a career for himself as a manager of caravans, if you will, like a freelance manager. He would hire himself out to the owners of caravans to become a manager for them. And he starts to build a reputation as a very, very good manager, very truthful, and every time those caravans come back, it's prosperous. There's always good trading happening. And so he reaches the stage where he's fairly financially independent. He's not rich, but he's fairly financially independent. He's got a bit of saving. And he thinks it's time for him to get married. So he goes to Abu Talib. Who else would he ask, right? Abu Talib, the closest person to him. And says, I would like to marry your daughter, Fakita, later known as Hani. And he is expecting Abu Talib to give him. Abu Talib refuses. So one thing when I read the Seerah, I always try to find things, hardships in the Prophet ﷺ's life that we can relate to, and there are many. I think I told you before, one is to help the Prophet ﷺ, but the other is to report back to Khadija. Khadija is smart. She's hiring this new person. She wants someone that she trusts to report back to her. So Maysara goes with the Prophet ﷺ in the caravan up to Syria. And guess what? They reach Bosra. When they reach Bosra, there is a monk by the name of, not Bahira this time, Nestor. Now we don't know what happened to Bahira, whether Bahira had passed away and he was replaced by a monk called Nestor. Some scholars actually say that Nestor isn't his name, it is a reference to him being a Nestorian monk. Nestorian was a group of Christians at the time. Either way, Nestor sees something special about this manager of the caravan. And he remembers a verse from the Bible. And I'll read that to you. So, in Genesis chapter 49, verses 1 to 10, it says this. And Jacob called unto his sons, so Jacob being Yaqub alayhi salam, called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. The scepter, so you know what a scepter is, the king's scepter, shall not depart from Judah. Judah was one of the tribes of Israel. Shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, nor someone who gives the law from the feet of Judah, until Shiloh comes, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Now Christians believe Shiloh as Isa alayhi salam. But Hamza Yusuf again says something very interesting. He says, although the Christians interpret Shiloh to mean Christ, if you look at the verse in Genesis, Yaqub is a prophet from Bani Israel, foretelling of a prophet who will not be from Bani Israel. The verse doesn't make any sense if Isa alayhi salam, because Isa is a direct descendant of Dawood and of Yaqub and is from the Bani Israel. He is saying that the scepter, the king's authority, the law will depart from Judah, Bani Israel, and will go to Shiloh, who will then gather the people. Now some of the Christians did interpret that as a prophet coming from outside of the tribe of Israel. Nestor was one such person, and he says, you look like that prophet, I think it is you. Now, when he was saying this, Maysara was also there. So they finished the trading. The Prophet ﷺ was very honest, obviously. They do a good trade. They come back. Maysara reports all these good things that happen. But he also reports to Khadija what Nestor says. Khadija takes this information and has a chat with her cousin. Anyone know what the cousin's name is? Anyone know who Khadija's cousin that she talks to about this is? Naufal. Naufal ibn Warqa is the cousin of Khadija, but he's also, some scholars say he was a Hanif, some scholars say he was a Christian, but he was a very learned person in religion. And Naufal says, yes, there is a verse like that, and perhaps it might be this person. So Khadija's interest in the Prophet ﷺ is now increased. At the same time, Khadija's friend Nufaisa comes to Khadija and says, what do you think about marrying this young man, Muhammad? And Khadija says, I've actually been thinking about him. All these things have happened. I am interested, but I don't know if he's interested. And Nufaisa says, leave it with me. And she goes to Prophet Muhammad says, what would you say to marry someone who is intelligent, who is wealthy, and is also beautiful? And he says, yes, I would be willing if she's willing, but I'm not very rich. And Nufaisa says, leave it with me. Nufaisa is playing matchmaker, goes in between, and organizing. They both understand that Khadija is, Prophet Muhammad realizes it's Khadija. Khadija is told that it's Prophet Muhammad. They both agree to get married. And when the Prophet comes to marry Khadija, Khadija explains to the Prophet why she chose to marry him. So you can there's one thing you can see from this. You can see the character of Khadija. She's a very smart person. And you can see, and she's very direct, and she explains why. She says, son of my uncle, I love you, and she'll go through the reasons. I love you for your care with me, because you're related to me, and we'll talk about that in a second. For you are ever the center, not being a partisan amongst people, for this or that. You're always just. You're always in the middle, and you always choose the just. You don't take sides. I love you for that. So that's the second reason. I love you because you are trustworthy. We know about that. And I love you for the beauty of your character. Inshallah, we will cover that as we go through the seerah. So we will cover, I love this part because Khadija kind of gives us what we should cover in the seerah. In respect for his relationship with Khadija, Hamza's sister, Hamza is Prophet Muhammad's uncle. Hamza's sister Safiya is married to Khadija's brother. So there is already a relationship type. Now, the Prophet ﷺ had a slave from his father Abdullah, who was his slave. We just talked about Barakah. Prophet ﷺ had the slave Barakah, but the Prophet ﷺ treated Barakah as his own mother. We talked about why. And on the wedding day, on the day that the Prophet ﷺ married Khadija, he freed Barakah. And Barakah went and married someone in Yathrib and left the Prophet ﷺ's house. Now, there's a reason I'm telling you this side story. We'll get back to that in a second. At the same time, as part of the wedding, Khadija gives Prophet Muhammad ﷺ one of the slaves that she had. So her cousin had bought a slave, given it to her. She looked after him and gives this slave to the Prophet ﷺ. Who is this slave? It's a very important person. I'll give you a clue. My son's named after him. Zayd ibn Harith. Zayd ibn Harith is a young boy. What had happened to him, his story was that he was visiting some relatives, and the relatives' camp had got attacked by another tribe, and he was captured and taken into slavery. He was sold from one person to another person. He came from the tribe of Kalb, which was up in the north. He came all the way down to Mecca. Khadija's cousin bought him, gave him as a gift to Khadija. Khadija had him for a while and then gave him as a gift to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, as we know, doesn't treat slaves as slaves. He treats them as family. And so he loved Zayd. Now, one day when Zayd was out in the marketplace, he saw some members from his tribe, the Kalb tribe. And he knows that his family is worrying. So he goes to them and tells them, tell my family I am safe, there's nothing to worry about, and I'm in a good place. These people go back and tell his father. His father and his uncle say, collect a lot of money, as much as they can, and they say, we're going to free him. So they come back down to Mecca and try to find him, and they find him in the home of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and they talk to the Prophet and say, we brought as much money as we can, we will give it to you, please free my son, and let him come back. And the Prophet ﷺ says, of course, let him decide what he wants to do, we'll call him. And Zayd is called, and the Prophet says, what would you like to do? Would you like to go back with your father? And Zayd says this, he says, well, if I can find the page, I would not choose any man in preference to you. You are to me as my father and mother. I have seen from this man such things that I could never choose another man above him. Can you understand what's happening? A boy who was taken away from his family into slavery, sold as a slave, is now telling in front of his father, I prefer my master to you. Sorry. That gives you an idea of the character of the Prophet ﷺ, of how amazing he has to be, that Zayd says, I cannot choose anyone above this man once I've seen this man. It's not possible, even my own father and my mother, because he has been my father and my mother. When the Prophet ﷺ hears this, he's overcome with emotion, and he takes Zayd by the hand, he goes to the Kaaba and says in front of everyone, witness that from this day forward, Zayd is now Zayd ibn Muhammad. I have adopted him. He is my son. We will see Zayd's story continues later and it progresses. But at this stage, he is now adopted as Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's son. We're now entering the Prophet ﷺ's age of 30s. We're getting to his 30s. The Prophet ﷺ's household was a very happy place. There was a lot of sadness. I'll talk about that. There was things that were happening, but it was a happy place, and it was a very, very lively place. For me, I always thought of prophets as very somber people who, sit quietly and think. And the Prophet ﷺ did have that time. We'll get to that bit where he had that phrase. But for most of his life, in his 30s, his house was a very bustling place. There was people coming in and going out, and Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and Khadija were very much in love. They loved each other and they were always together. There's a lot of narrations we see of certain difficulties that the Prophet ﷺ had with his wives, like ISHA, and other wives, but there isn't many of him with Khadija. Khadija was a strength. He was a support for her and loved him, and they were both always on the same page, and I'll tell you an example of that. The Prophet ﷺ had 6 children with Khadija. The first was, anyone know? A son by the name of Qasim. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ got the nickname Abu Qasim. Qasim very sadly dies before the age of 2. He then has Zainab, Ruqayya, Kulthum, Fatima, and another son, Abdullah, who also dies very young. So both his sons, both the boys die very young, but his daughters are alive. But it so happened that as the Prophet ﷺ loses 2 boys, he also gains 2 boys. One of the boys he gains is Zayd. The other one, anyone knows? Anyone knows who? Okay. Abu Talib at this time, like I said, was really struggling financially. And he had a lot of children. So Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and Khadija have a conversation and they say, let's help him. Remember how I said they're always on the same page? This is one of the examples. They decide to help him. So they go and talk to the Prophet ﷺ's uncle, Abbas. And they say, we will take guardianship of one of Abu Talib's sons. Are you happy to take guardianship of another? And he says, yes. So Abbas and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and Khadija go to Abu Talib. And Abbas says, I will look after Jafar. That's Ali's elder brother, who is 15 years at this time. And Prophet ﷺ says, I have a daughter who is similar age to Ali. I will look after Ali for you. So now the Prophet ﷺ's household, there's 4 daughters, 2 boys, all very young. So for those families who have very young families and a lot of kids running around and it's stressful, the Prophet's experienced that. His house was that. His house had a lot of kids. And it ran around. And there were people coming in and going out. But Khadija and the Prophet ﷺ were the best of parents. And they raised these kids very well. And they had a very happy family. When Zainab gets to the age that she can be married, Khadija marries her to her nephew. And when Kulthum and Ruqayya get to the age of marriage, Abu Lahab comes to them to my sons. Abu Lahab comes. Abu Lahab, you can kind of get an idea of his personality. He likes power and he likes money. He tries to marry Khadija for power and money, but that didn't work. Now he's starting to see that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is this up-and-coming new leader of the Quraysh. Everyone's talking about him. He's respected, he's loved, he's trustworthy, he's from a very good family, he's now married into a wealthy family. Abu Lahab wants to make relationships with him. Even though it is his uncle, he wants to strengthen his relationship. So he says, let your daughters marry my son. There's an interesting thing from this as well. That when people say that astaghfirullah, that the Prophet was not a prophet because he did this to get power. If he wanted power and leadership, the best thing for him to do was to keep the status quo, because that was where he was heading. He was already, everyone had accepted that he was going to be one of the future leaders. By declaring he was a prophet, he actually shook all that up. He lost all that. So he was already set up for that. And an example of this is Abu Lahab trying to marry his daughters to his son, Abu Lahab's sons. Now at the time when the girls were leaving the house, Barakah came back. We don't know what happened. She came back by herself. There's no records of whether they got divorced or the husband died. She comes back and the Prophet welcomes her back into the house as almost like it's his mother. Sorry. So in this household, you can see in this very small house, there are a lot of people. And there's a lot of people who are visiting them. One of these people was a close family friend and close friend of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, a person by the name of Abu Sufyan ibn Harith. Not the famous Abu Sufyan. We're not talking about Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harb. That's different. This is Abu Sufyan ibn Harith. Abu Sufyan ibn Harith was the son of Harith, who was the son of Abdul Muttalib. Harith was the person who helped Abdul Muttalib find the well of Zamzam, the eldest son. Sad thing here is though, that when the Prophet ﷺ said he was a prophet, Abu Sufyan didn't support him, even though he was a close friend and grew up with him. Now, I had a really nice slide of the Prophet's extended family, and it shows you who supported him and who didn't. Unfortunately, don't have that up. Another family was the Jash family. The Jash family was the Prophet ﷺ's paternal aunt's children, and they all supported him. And there's a lot of relationships that we'll get into later from that family. But to give you an idea, when the Prophet ﷺ declared his prophethood, 5 uncles supported him. They didn't say he was the prophet. We were talking about early on. They didn't say he was the prophet necessarily, but they supported him. They protected him and they helped him. 5 uncles remained neutral. They didn't support him, but they didn't act against him. Only 1 uncle fought against him. Everyone knows who he is, Abu Lahab. But from his 12 cousins, 12 cousins supported him. 12 cousins, some of them became Muslim, others supported him. 2 remained neutral, and 6 were against him, and unfortunately Abu Sufyan, his close friend, was one of them. Again, if you've ever felt betrayal by a very close friend you grow up with, the Prophet ﷺ felt that. Now, I'm just wondering if we have time to get to the next big thing. At this time, there was a flash flood that happens. This is fairly common in Mecca, where it rains suddenly, that there's so much rain the soil can't absorb it and it floods. A flash flood happens and it damages the Kaaba. Also during this time, the Kaaba's height was just a little above the height of a person, not like it is now. And so the wall's damaged, there is no roof, the roof has collapsed in, and the door is also damaged, that someone actually broke in and stole some treasures from there. And so the Quraysh are thinking, we need to rebuild this. And luckily for them, 2 things happened. One, a Coptic carpenter was visiting, and he said, I'm willing to help you rebuild the Kaaba. The second thing is, in Jeddah, a Greek ship had run aground, and all the wood from the ship was available for them to rebuild the Kaaba. But there was one big problem the Quraysh had. Anyone know what that problem was? Any guesses? To rebuild the Kaaba? Guess. Not money. They had money. They had wood, they had a carpenter, they had money. They had a big problem, they were hesitating. Anyone? No, they had stone. They could find stone. They got stone. They were scared. They were scared because the carpenter told them to rebuild the Kaaba, you got to destroy the Kaaba. And this had never happened in living memory. And they were so scared that if they destroyed, because the thing they remembered was Abraha. Remember, there were people still alive. They're thinking, Abraha tried to destroy the Kaaba, and look what happened to him. What happens if we try? So they're all standing around with pickaxes, and none of them willing to actually bring the walls down. Except for one person who's the chief of the Makhzum. So he takes a pickaxe, he builds the courage, and he goes, and he starts chanting. He says, "Oh God, please do not be scared. We're not going to harm you. We're only doing this out of good." I say this so you understand the mentality of the Arabs at this time. They're worried that God's going to be scared because the God doesn't understand what he's going to do. This is the mentality that Prophet ﷺ broke and destroyed. I want you to understand how different things became when Islam came. Anyway, he says this and he goes and destroys the wall. And everyone's waiting and they say, let's give it 24 hours. Let's see if he drops dead or not. The next day when he doesn't drop dead, they realize, okay, it's fine. And they start breaking down the Kaaba. When they're breaking down the Kaaba and rebuilding it, each clan takes shifts. So they don't work together. Each clan has their shift and they'll do a side. It also gives you an idea of how strong tribalism was. Finally, they rebuild it, but they get to a point where only one tribe can do this thing. You know what it is? Putting the black stone back in. They can't decide which tribe is going to put the black stone in. And so now there's an argument. They're arguing backwards and forwards, and they get close to even fighting. And they finally say, look, whoever walks into the Kaaba next, let him decide. And the person who walks in is Prophet Muhammad. And we are told that all the tribes, every single person there rejoiced. They were so happy that it was him because they knew that he was impartial, he was trustworthy, and he was just. Again, we have evidence of how the Quraysh thought of him before he became the Prophet. The Prophet, we know the story, tells them to bring a blanket, puts a blanket on the ground, puts the black stone, and then tells every leader of the tribe to hold the edges of the cloak, the blanket, and they lift it together. And the Prophet takes the stone himself and puts it in. Every time if you go do Umrah or Hajj, or if you're lucky enough to touch the black stone, please remember you're also touching the stone that the Prophet ﷺ touched, and other prophets. So we'll stop there, but I'll give you a quick fun fact. Historians and scholars estimate that the Kaaba was reconstructed between 6 to 12 times in the history of mankind. The first was obviously Adam alayhi salam, then Ibrahim alayhi salam, and then we don't know who, but there is belief that it happened a few times in between. But the next one was during the Prophet's time, which we just talked about. But there was such a big gap from this time to the last time that people actually forgotten how to reconstruct the Kaaba or what happened if you do it. After the Prophet ﷺ, the next one was by Abdullah Ibn Azubair. Anyone who knows Islamic history knows this person, a very famous person. There was Caliph Abdul Malik bin Marwa, he reconstructed it. And then it was the Ottoman Sultan, Murad Khan, who reconstructed it. And then after Sultan Murad Khan, it was in 1996, the Saudi government reconstructed the Kaaba, and that is the Kaaba that we still have to this day. It hasn't been changed since then. Okay, inshallah, we will stop there, and we will see you all next week. I hope you enjoyed it. I think the food truck's still out there if you want to run and get some if you haven't had any already. Inshallah, I think around 7:30 we'll have ISHA prayer. Assalamu alaikum.